The Pro Show is brought to you by Rockin' Media and our proprietary Flash HDR photo process, providing you with the best, most realistic photos of your property. See the difference at rockinmedia.com. Hi and welcome to The Pro Show. I'm Rick Machle, and on this show we are talking all about real estate photography and what you need to know in order to be informed relative to the agent that you hire, because you would think real estate photography is all the same. Well, it isn't. We're going to talk about that. Nancy will be talking about mortgages and what you should and shouldn't do right before you close. Greg will be talking about rentals. That's all next on The Pro Show. So today's show is going to be a little bit different than our previous shows. In our other shows, we've had agents from up and down the Colorado Front Range. Today, we're going to be talking about photography, which, if many of you know, I own a real estate media production company called Rockin' Media, and today we're going to talk about photography and why it's important. So what you might think is, hey, that's something my agent takes care of, and that may be true, but you're also going to want to know a little bit about the different types of photography because they're not all made the same. Now, in 21, 22 time period, you pretty much could take iPhone pictures and it would sell. Today, that is a whole lot different because obviously you want to make the best impression on your buyers. And you've bought real estate, I'm sure, because you're selling your home. And if you are going to sell your home, you want to have it look in its best light so that people will actually come and take a look and buy it. And there are different ways of taking real estate photography, and we're going to talk about those, and that will then make you a more educated consumer. Now, if you're listening to this on the podcast, it's probably going to be, even though I'm going to try and describe what's in the pictures, it's like trying to describe the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I can describe the pieces, but you can't see it. So I'd encourage you to go to the Pro Show and then click on the link to watch it on YouTube, or you can find it on Facebook as well. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about the different types of photography. First, there's flash photography, which not very many people do by itself. Then there's HDR photography, and we'll talk about what that stands for. Then there's flambient, which there isn't a lot going on in Colorado, but it's very big on both coasts. And then there's Flash HDR, which is a proprietary process that we use here at Rockin' Media, and it's something that I developed. And that's mainly because I could not find a process that worked for me after doing this. So in the first 10 years of my doing real estate photography, and it's been about 20 now, we did flash photography mainly because there was no such thing as HDR. And flash photography is basically you take a single exposure. It's similar to what you did with your old Instamatic. It has very accurate colors, but in order to equalize the lighting between the indoor and the outdoor, we had to bring in big lights and really blast the room. Well, when you do that, first of all, it gives harsh shadows and shadows that aren't there in real life because you're bringing in extra lights, and it can also lead to a very flat look. The color is great, but it's also very flat. If you look in the upper part of this picture up on the ceiling, you will see a shadow of the ceiling fan, and that's because the flash is casting that shadow. And so it was actually a pretty good way of doing it, but we ended up not having it look a lot like the house, except when it came to having the photos look very accurate as far as the color is concerned. And so we went away from flash photography in the early 2010s, and that's because a new process came out, and that's called HDR photography. Now, HDR stands for high dynamic range. It doesn't stand for high definition. Nobody knows what the R stands for. It stands for high dynamic range, and the eyeball your eyeball is the best HDR camera there is, because you can look at the window frame of a window and see all the details, and then on the outside you can also see maybe a mountain range or water like an ocean or a lake. Well, the camera can't do that. It either sees the lighting of the inside of the room very good and everything else outside is very blown out unless you add flash to it. So in order to compensate for this fact that you can't see indoor and outdoor together, we end up taking multiple exposures. We started out with 3 different exposures, a dark, a medium, and a light. Then we ended up going to 5. We ended up finally in the end settling on 7, and that had as much to do with how much time it takes to process them, because the more exposures, you have to merge all those layers together. And unfortunately, that, you can do 11, 13, you can do almost as many as you want. It's just with most real estate photographers, they have very little time to, wait for the computer just to merge all those layers. Now, one of the issues that you end up with in real estate photography is that that's HDR photos is the exposures are great, and it gives that natural look because we can now use the natural lighting of the room. But you end up with a lot of color variations, and it was okay when we had incandescent, fluorescent, and outdoor lighting. That was basically the 3 that pretty much anything would have, and our cameras could kind of adjust to that. But what ended up happening was LED lighting is we ended up with millions of different lighting color temperatures, and the cameras just couldn't keep up. Another issue is that you end up with color variations because the outdoor lighting casts a blue cast on the walls. So if you have white walls, they're going to have a blue tinge. Then you have incandescent lighting that is yellow, and that same white wall in a different part of the room will look very yellowy. And your eye can compensate for that in real life, but it doesn't do a great job when you are looking at a photograph. The other issue is that views can be hazy. So if you notice in this picture, you can see what's out there. There's trees and clouds, but it's kind of hazy outside. And so that tends to, not bring in the views as well as it possibly can. Also, another issue that is difficult to talk about and compensate for is that reds and the different pinks and browns tend to change color, because as we go from dark exposure to light exposure, the light exposure will make reds look pinker, and basically all colors will be different and the wrong colors, but reds will look pinker, browns will look oranger because it'll bring in that orange. And so you have to do a lot of work in post-production in order to make sure that that will compensate for that. And you never totally get rid of it because you might, as I said before, you might have different color temperatures inside the same picture. So you might be getting rid of some of the yellow in one part of it, the room, and that may overcompensate where you need more yellow in a different part of the room. So we were constantly chasing our tail, and that's one of the things that ended up happening with HDR photos. I love the natural look, but there were also a lot of drawbacks to it, and so that's when we changed over. And here's a couple more examples. Notice you can see the yellow in the light above. That looks pretty natural. The carpet was probably a little bit browner than this because it was lightened up, but you can see the mountains outside of this window here, but they are still kind of hazy. And it's not because we had a Colorado wildfire that day. It's because the brighter exposures tend to wash out the views out the windows where they're already bright. So the dark exposures bring in the outside, the light exposures reduce the shadows inside, but the bright exposures will also tend to wash out those views. So here's an example. This is one where we actually had a lot of pretty good interior lighting, so the composite came out pretty good, but it was still a little washed out. So here is the darkest exposure, and then we take another exposure, then we take another exposure and another exposure, and notice now we're starting to see the logs underneath the TV. Well, those were totally gone relative to the views outside. And so now we're at the brightest exposure, and then we take all those different layers, and through different software, we merge those together, and that merging process then gives you this composite image. It's okay, except that the colors in the flooring are incorrect. You have some color casting on the ceiling. The couch is probably not that color. I think it's a little darker than that. And so this shot shows how the process works, but it doesn't necessarily take care of the issues. This was one of the better examples of HDR photos because it was so bright in this room. We didn't have a lot of dark walls. It was very well lit because of those huge windows. So that made the difference between the outdoor and the indoor less. So HDR photography means you have high dynamic range. So the less dynamic range you have in the picture, the better the shot will be. And in this case, we had much less dynamic range. A couple of photographers on the coasts ended up coming up with a combination that used flash photography, and you bounce the flash in different places. You merge those layers together. Then you do window shots in order to bring the outside in, and then those layers are cut out. That works pretty well, except for the fact that sometimes you have those crossbars inside. I think they're called mullins inside the windows. Well, what if those are white and you basically have just darkened the windows for the window? Either you have to cut out all the little panes and mask those out and then drop them into the main photo, or you need to go ahead and you need to just say, well, those are going to be dark crossbars, because that's what's going to happen when you darken the overall image to see the proper exposure outside. So that process is called flambient. We don't do a lot of that in Colorado, and so that makes it a little more, it's an okay process. But once again, the pictures, in my opinion, are very flat. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring up here is that you may like flambient, you may like flash, you may like HDR look, you may like our process, which is called flash HDR. None, I can't say any of those are wrong. In other words, it's artwork. So we tend to lean more toward the we'll call it the Rembrandt, the realistic side. Others try and go to more of a brighter shot, but it doesn't look as much like the property. And that's not great, because you want it to look like the property, in my opinion. But you may like that look. So as I mentioned in the HDR process, the only way to get rid of those color variations is to super brighten the pictures. Well, when you super brighten the pictures, what happens? The colors are changed. If you have a dark chocolate floor, now it might be milk chocolate. When you have a red wall, it might be more to the pink side. When you have a blue wall that's dark blue, it might be a lighter blue, because you're blowing things out in order to compensate for those color variations. And then a lot of the companies will also drop in the windows so that they can see out the windows. They'll just mask them out and drop those in electronically. But it ends up not really looking like the property, because they're basically doing tricks with HDR in order to get around the process that it invariably has when you're actually doing HDR photography. So that's obviously not a great thing, because you want your property to look like it does, not like something else. So that's one of the things you have to keep in mind, is that a lot of people do HDR, they do modified HDR, but essentially they are going to brighten everything up. So once again, if you have gray walls, they're going to be white. If you have off-white or tan walls, they may be white as well, because that's how they're getting around the color issue. So what I did a couple of years ago was I created a process called Flash HDR, and this takes the natural look of HDR with the color accuracy of Flash, and that's why I call it Flash HDR. It's something that's proprietary to us, so nobody else is doing it. And it takes the HDR photo with the combined different layers that I showed you before and combines that with flash photos, multiple flash photos. Typically, it's at least 2. Many times it can be 3, 4, 5. It makes them natural and bright, so we can brighten them up, and we get more accurate colors, and then we have clear windows and views. We do that by also taking different window shots, but how we bring those in is completely different than what you see in Flambient. So here's an example of one of those shots, and notice we can see out the windows. It was a little hazy that day, and so that's another thing to keep in mind, is that when your photographer comes in to your house and says, yeah, I'm doing Flambient or I'm doing HDR, but I drop in the windows, they're not going to be able to see views that aren't there, nor can we. What we do is accurately resemble and reflect what those views actually are at the day we shot. So as you can see, this is a great shot. What we'd find out with HDR is that the ceiling would be the wrong color. It wouldn't be all white. We'd have color casting from outside, and that would then cause that ceiling to be a different color. Here's another shot that we have with of a living room, and as you can see here, we can see out the windows. There's a lot of variations on this shot, including the fire in the fireplace. We can see the dark woods in the ceilings, and so that's a big difference. Now I'm going to show you some examples. This is a standard HDR photo. If you look at the beams and in trusses and posts in this shot, they're a little bit orange, and I told you earlier that HDR will tend to make things orange. When we were doing straight HDR, we would do some work to actually make the windows look a little bit less hazy, but we could only do so much based on the technology. But you can see out this window. We had agents sell millions, probably $1 billion worth of real estate using this photography. And many of the agents that we do photography for basically said, well, I've never had a problem with your photos. And I can totally understand that, because, it's perfectly acceptable. Now, what we ended up doing was we went through, and so now what we ended up doing was, this is actually the flash shot. So notice the color of the beams now and the woods in the door frame and on the floor. That's accurate color, but look out the windows. It's totally blown out. As I mentioned, the camera can't do much, and when we do our Flash HDR, we don't actually bring in huge lights so that we can equalize the lighting between the indoor and the outdoor. We do take some extra pictures of the outside, and then those all get merged into one shot, where now you can see that the beams look natural, the floor is the right color, and you can see out the windows. Here's the standard HDR photo, same shot, and now with our process, how it all merged together. And notice how the beams, the ceilings still look natural, but they actually are correct, and now we can see out the windows. This is a shot I did on a property about 10 years ago. And as you can tell, it's a little bit dark. I told you that the brighter exposures will bring out the reds and oranges in woods. We do a ton of work in order to make sure that it was gone. But as you can see in the upper right-hand corner of this picture, it is also very red still, because we couldn't get rid of it all, or we would have changed the color in the table in the foreground. We were able to do some painting of the windows to bring in those shots, but notice it's very dark behind the couch. That chair in the foreground is pretty dark. We just had limitations because of the physics of HDR photos. So a couple years ago, I went back to the same house. The people who owned it, after they bought it from the same agent, had us back. And this is the exact same shot using the Flash HDR process. And it is definitely looks like a totally different place, even though the furniture is exactly the same. Here's the shot as we took it 10 years ago, And then here it is with Flash HDR. That ceiling obviously is not a red ceiling. It's actually more of a yellow ceiling, but we pulled that yellow out in order to fix the rest of the shot, especially the wood logs in the walls. It looks like the house now, and we can also see out the windows just as well because of the way that we're taking shots to equalize for the windows. When you're doing HDR, the brighter exposures will take black and make them gray, especially notice around the windows in this shot. There's a lot of gray in that shot, whereas in the right-hand corner, that black is more like what it is. It is what it is. It's a black wall. So blacks, especially if you've got really bright outside, would be really, really difficult. And so a lot of companies will just brighten it up and it'll all look kind of grayish to get rid of some of the color issues. Here's the Flash HDR version of that, and notice how we still have black around the windows. We can see out there, but it's more equalized and everything looks natural. Here's another Flash HDR photo where we can see the wood tones in the shot. We can also see the fire in the fireplace. We can see out the windows in all these shots. And you still have that natural look of the lighting in the ceiling. You don't want that to be totally white because it isn't. And this would be an impossible shot using HDR because of all the different colors. And so the Flash HDR process makes this a lot easier. We get great views out the windows, plus it looks natural inside, which is why I spent a whole lot of time figuring this out, which is why I took a lot of time in this process to develop it. But it's very complex. The main reason most other companies don't do it is it's labor intensive. It takes about 50% longer when we're on site than regular HDR, or more. It can even take more than that. Typically, when we could do a house in half an hour, it will now take an hour to an hour and a quarter with the Flash HDR because of all the different exposures and flash shots that we're doing. In addition to that, the back-end processing is manual. We can't upload this to the cloud. Maybe someday we will, but we can't yet and have a computer do it. So it takes our photographers actually manually merging all those layers together so that it looks like the property. And so it's why I'm not that concerned about putting this information out on the web, because everybody else will look at this and go, yeah, I'm not going to do that because it's too labor intensive. But our photographers want the property to look like it does. So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk about aerial photography. Well, you're used to seeing myself and Greg Batchelor doing the rental segment on the past, 30-ish pro shows. Yes, and today we're at the Broadmoor, if you can't tell, over my shoulder. And we're at a Coldwell Banker event. And we thought, what the heck? Great day. Might as well do it. Awesome to see you in person. Likewise, instead of just Rick. Via Zoom.
I know, I love it.
It's great. Well, so today we're talking about regulatory issues coming up as far as rentals in 2025. So what's going on?
Yeah, so one of the things we're beginning to see, Rick, on that particular front, and this is not a surprise, any of the proposals that are hitting the House floor, Senate floor, they continue to be focused on what is going to help tenants more from a regulatory standpoint. That has obviously been the push in Colorado. Things have become more tenant friendly versus landlord friendly. So it's not a surprise to see more measures hitting the House and Senate floor that look just like that. And I suspect that we're going to see more.
And what are some of the proposed changes this year?
Yeah, so some of the ones that we've seen thus far are addressing fees. They're addressing junk fees. They are addressing how things get disclosed and making sure that there is proper amounts of disclosure to go along with that. Some of the things that we've seen in the past that they're now adding onto or proposing additions onto are prohibited clauses in lease agreements and some things around pets and obviously service animals, the differentiations between the two. So a lot of those things are beginning to hit the radar screen.
And how do I find out about it?
When those bills get passed, we have a great law firm, the law firm of Cheddar Souls or Muccio, that does a great job of keeping us and many other property management companies abreast of what's transpiring there, and that will continue. Now, how it gets placed out to the general public, that'll end up just rolling out in other measures as the Senate and House push them out. Exactly.
Well, that's really great news, Greg. And obviously, Greg has a ton of information. He and his team do. As always, if you want to get a hold of Greg, you can do so at the number on the screen. And once again, great to see you again, and we'll see you next week.
Next week it is. See you, Rick. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks. So next I want to talk about aerial photos, and when we're talking about this, we're not talking about, obviously, the old days we would actually bring in a helicopter if we needed aerial photography, or we also had a 50-foot quad pod, like a big tripod, to get aerial photos. Today we're talking about aerial photos, and these are usually done with a drone. In fact, 99% of them are done with a drone. So let's talk about what makes that a good process to have. It can differentiate your listing. It's great for large properties because you can see past the home. You can also see, the home head on. And a lot of times when we are doing a photo shoot, we might be in the mountains and the building sits on the side of a hillside. And if you're shooting the back of that, you may end up looking up at the back of the house, and all you're seeing is the undersides of all the decks. So when we talk about aerial photography, it could be 6 feet up, it could be 9 feet up, it could be 50 feet up, or it could be 250 feet up. Those are all done in order to get the best shot of the house. Sometimes you want to go high enough to see the lake behind the house, but not so high that you see there's a road between you and the lake. So we can often, just by elevating it a few feet or lowering it a few feet, can make it a little easier to show off that property in its best, most realistic light. So that's some of the pros, but some of the cons are that obviously it's subject to wind. It can show how close it is to neighbors. So if your house is really close to the neighbor, you may not want to have aerial photos, but you go, I've got a great shot of the lake behind my house and I want to have that in the shot. Just know that as you go up, the drone tends to make things look even closer. So even if they're 20 feet apart, they might look 10 feet apart from the drone. So it might be we just shoot a little bit above the house. We might still see the neighbors, but you would then not have it where you're actually seeing how close the neighbors are to you. In addition to that, there are obviously FAA restrictions, which is why we still have a quad pod, tripod, so that if there's no fly zones, we can't fly there. So that's some of the cons of aerial photography, but the real drawback is if you live next to an airport, we just can't fly. The drones are too smart, and that's good for the general public so that they're safe from having drones fly into them. But what it isn't great for is if you're trying to get that aerial shot. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when you're doing aerial photos. So as we look at this house, this is a perfect example for aerial because you can see the house in the foreground and you can see nothing's behind it, except for on the far left you see a house and on the far right you see a house, but ooh, look at that, there's a pond. And on this one, you can see that this house sits on the side of a hill. So once again, if we were trying to take a shot of this house from down below, we would see the underside of the deck because it didn't have a very deep yard. So we'd be looking straight up at the back of this house. Obviously, this house sits on the side of a hill, and there would be no way to get this shot without a drone. And this is one where the front of the house slopes down quite a bit, so we wouldn't be able to get this shot as well without looking straight on with the drone. But that doesn't mean we need to go up 200 feet to get this shot. We might, but the best shot of this house, showing all the different landscaping and the little gazebo there, as well as the great patio, was probably about 25 feet up from the ground. Here's one where we're a little bit higher. We might be about 75 feet up, where you can see the Boulder Flatirons in the background. They got a great pool. You can see that their backyard backs to open space, even with this shot, because there's nothing behind it. And then in addition, you've got the back of the house. Here's another house that shows how close the other homes are to the home in the very center of this shot, but they wanted to see the pond and the mountains behind, which show the views. This is a shot from the ground of a condo building. Now, as you can tell, the walls, because we're looking straight up, kind of bow in and make it look like this condo building isn't even square. So just by going up maybe 15 feet, we're able to square up this condo building. Here's the shot of the actual condo there in the center. And what we are able to do is then just go up a little bit. The lighting didn't help us a whole lot on this one because of the sun was right behind the house. It was winter time, and this condo faced north, and the sun was right behind it. But we were able to still get that shot with a little bleed in from the sun. Now, next, we'll take another break, and we'll come back and talk about Twilight photos. Joining us every week is Nancy Alexander from Smart Mortgage Services. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Rick. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. You?
Good. Very good.
So today we are talking about how you can mess up getting to closing by doing stuff that will ruin it so your mortgage may not fund. So what are some examples of that? It's not fun to do, but you got to think about these things because people go on autopilot.
I was going to say, thank God it doesn't happen very often, right?
Yeah.
But, the most obvious one is you no longer have your job.
Oh,
right?
True.
And the job that we approved you on, you no longer have that income. So that's an automatic that it goes out the window. If you're switching jobs in between the transaction, that's not going to kill the deal, but losing the job will. Buying an automobile, buying something large, a trailer. I've had a gentleman buy a Harley Davidson before. That killed the deal because it messes with your debt to income, of course, and you become non-qualified.
Okay.
What else, Rick? What are other things that we do as people too?
Well, you live, so you figure you need to do stuff like buy cars or whatever, and because your car dies and it was paid off, and now you go out and buy a new one, right? So that would definitely impact it because that could change your ratios.
Well, it changes your ratios and it changes your credit score, right? And so it's going to change your pricing if it doesn't totally affect you of not getting to the closing table. It will alter the structure of the deal, no question. So, if your deal is 30 days or 45 days, whatever you wrote the contract for your time frame from beginning to close, just contain yourself in the sense of, don't go out and buy the washer, the dryer, the new couch, the new car, try, obviously, to keep your job intact. Today, that may be a little more difficult than normal. And those are probably the biggest ones that I can think of because everything else shows itself in the beginning.
So do you do a new VOE right before closing, verification of employment, or not?
That's a great question. Yes, we do. We do a verification of employment 72 hours before closing.
Okay.
So we'll verify your employment at the beginning, and then we're going to verify it kind of silently, if you will, at the end to make sure that employment is still intact. What happens the day after close?
but it's not your problem. But this right. that none of these things are things you should. I call it possuming, right? Where you just go underground and go, okay, they might not know, and we'll just squeak through it. First of all, if you just lost your job, how are you going to pay that mortgage?
I mean, really, the one question the lender asks, right, is what is your ability to repay?
Right.
And that's what that income stream shows that lender.
Okay.
And you lose that income stream, that ability is gone as well. You're right.
And it could be, say, your spouse or significant other that's co-signing if your parents are co-signing and they lose their job or choose to move to a different job right before they close, because all those things can really mess it up, and you need to be cognizant of it. And are you also pulling a credit report then right before?
You're pulling a credit report in the beginning, really in the pre-approval stages, and that credit report is good with most agencies for 90 days.
Okay.
Some will push it to 120, but that's only a few. So you figure 90 days from the time you pulled your credit. You obviously want to keep that credit intact. You want to make your payments as you normally would, etc. Right? And so we don't pull a second credit report, but it's that income piece, Rick, that you brought up that that is so critical that it stays stable.
So theoretically, not saying you should do this, theoretically, buying that car could be something you could, we'll say, get away with. I wouldn't do it because it's really making it hard for you to make that mortgage payment. That's really what you guys are all looking at, right? So,
We've certainly had people go out and buy cars.
Yeah.
But talk to your loan officer, talk to me, tell your loan officer while you're in the process, hey, my car just died. I don't have any other option. I had a client one time, they got in an accident and the car was totaled. So they needed a new car. And as long as we play with the numbers and say, okay, yes, even with the new car payment, your debt to income is still acceptable for approval, then go do what you need to do. But if it's not, hold off until you close that deal.
Is there something at closing that you basically sign that says that nothing material has changed, or is that it kind of an honor system?
It's an honor system.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question, because really life happens and life continues to go on. Interest is accrued every day, payments are made, etc. So it's not that we expect someone to stay stagnant.
Right.
We just expect them to stay within the boundaries that we've gotten that loan approved on.
Right. Yeah. Don't go out and buy that $100,000 RV right before closing. Buy it the day after closing if you think you can handle both.
That's right.
Well, if you want to get more tips on things, feel free to reach out to Nancy. I'm sure she'd love to talk to you about what you should and shouldn't do right before closing. And I think next week we should talk about what you should do if your appraisal doesn't come in, because obviously that's a big deal. And are there ways around it? Are there ways to fix it? That sort of thing. So we'll talk about that next week. And as always, great to have you on. Thanks, Nancy. So twilight photos, in our case and most cases, means shot at dusk. These are taken, we start usually about 20 minutes before sunset, and then we go about 40 minutes after sunset. They make your home stand out online, so that's one of the benefits of twilight photos. They de-emphasize the dormant foliage in the winter, and sometimes the home looks even better in the winter because you can actually see the home, whereas in the summer, the leaves might be blocking the home. But a twilight photo will actually make that look even better. It also is a great way to reintroduce your home to the marketplace, because people oftentimes will click through, go, I don't like this house, I don't like this house, oh, what's this one? But the next time they come through, if you've got a twilight photo there, they may go, wait, I don't remember that home. So it can reintroduce your home to the marketplace. Here again, because a lot of times we will do twilight drone photos, they're subject to wind. And even if we're on the ground, if it's too windy, because we're doing those multiple exposures like we do on the inside, what we end up with is blurriness in some of the longer exposures. So it has to be fairly calm. In our case, about 10 mile an hour or below. We can go up to 15 to 20, but it just means we have to stop earlier in the time because the exposures are too long. It's not ideal for small homes or homes that don't have any windows on the front, because what are you going to see except one sconce light? And in our case, it's subject to availability. We can do a lot more daytime shoots than we can nighttime shoots, because we only have one photographer can do one twilight shoot each night. So it's subject to availability, and that's one of the issues. So here's a twilight shot that's great, that has a pool, and the pool is awesome because it actually really looks great at night. This would be a great shot during the day. It's an awesome home, but it would also be much more blasé during the day, and we wouldn't be able to see the windows and that lighting in the dining area in the very center of this picture. You can see the hot tub off to the left and the little sitting area just above the hot tub. So this is a great example of twilight photos. Here's an example of what I talked about before. This home was sitting back off of a hill. The backside was off of a hill. So we did a Twilight drone shot on this one, and it was very calm, so that made it possible to get this shot. But this made this home look great because all the big windows were capturing the views to the west, and what we're able to see where you can even see the logs through the windows. And the hardest thing is making sure you as a homeowner aren't in the picture. This is a great shot of a pool with a wonderful home behind it, and this home just really pops with a Twilight shot. Obviously, fire pits don't show up well during the day. This one shows up great at night. You can also see the lighting under the deck. So this was a great one. We also had some cool clouds, so we got a little bit of sky burst on this one. And speaking of sky bursts, this is like an amazing one. You will see a lot of twilights or virtual twilights where they come back and they'll put in a fake sky or a virtual sky in there. This actually happened to be a great shot where we got the great lighting, we got the great clouds, but it's not very dark, because we wanted to use the one with the great clouds, but it was a great shot. And this here again, this home slipped off of the straight down, so we did this with the drone as well. So now let's talk about virtual staging. Virtual staging is when you've got a home that's either vacant or has a lot of older furniture, or you just don't have time to declutter. With virtual staging, they can digitally remove items and then add additional items back in. Now, what we do is we upload our photos to a company called Box Brownie, and we don't own any part of them. We don't get any compensation from them. They just do a great job, so we recommend them. And all you do is you upload our photos, or your agent will upload our photos. They'll select the type of furniture layout, and they get the photos back with a layout within 24 to 48 hours. And this is great, especially if you have a vacant property and you're moving and you say, I don't have time to get it staged. I just need it to look great online. And so what you can do is, this is the way we took this picture. And this is the shot virtually staged. Notice all the items on the bookshelf, the desk, the rug, the chairs by the window, the flowers none of that is real. It's all virtually staged. And that makes it a great use, because to stage a home in real life, if it doesn't sell quickly, can cost thousands of dollars. And these pictures can be virtually staged for under $25. And you say, well, what about when they show up? There won't be any furniture. Well, that was going to be the case anyway. And a lot of times agents will do a big blow-up printout and put it on an easel in that room so that you can see it. And so that really helps. I want to show you a few more of these. None of the furniture in this shot, or the rug underneath, or the painting on the wall, or even the furniture outside were actually there. This was a totally vacant space. And you can see it looks like furniture is actually there, so that people can get an idea of what your home looks like with furniture. And it can be very contemporary furniture, because I also live with furniture I've had for 15 years. Well, maybe you want to have something a little more that's more contemporary, but you don't want to go out and have your agent, or you don't want to pay for actual staging. They can remove your furniture and then put in virtual furniture. Here again, none of the furniture in this shot, or the rug, or the paintings on that brick wall are actually in real life there. This is a shot that we did where this is the way we photographed it. And then we came in, and in the rec room, they put in this ping pong table, they put in a pool table, they put in the pictures on the walls, and the homeowner liked it so much they actually bought those items that they were going to take to their new home and just had them put in so that when people showed up, they could actually have those there. This is a home, and was one of the very first homes. In fact, the very first home before I started recommending Box Brownie. And this was, as you can tell, the old HDR process. As you look out the windows, it's kind of hazy, and that's because it was very dark in this space. But notice the rug is very old. The 1980s deep oak entertainment center on the wall there. The chairs were kind of, dated. So what we did was we actually went in and took out all that furniture and put virtual furniture in that space. And that made it look much better. This shot, the furniture inside the dining area is real, but it was March, and so the furniture out on the deck hadn't been placed out there, and Box Brownie actually put the flowers in the flower boxes around the perimeter, and we didn't even ask them to do that. They just did it when we got it, and so that was a big deal. Now, some of you may have heard there's something called a virtual twilight, where you take daytime shots and turn them into a twilight. Box Brownie also does these. And so what they do is they take our daytime shot and then they turn it into a nighttime shot and put a virtual sky behind it. But notice the shadow on the garage door. That wouldn't be there because the sun is already down. What's really cool is they can also get rid of that shadow to make it look more realistic. It will never look like an actual twilight, but it's a good alternative, especially if you're in a pinch to get it done quickly. This home, it was actually sleeting that day, and the agent was really upset because it didn't look great. But I said, well, why don't we turn this into a virtual twilight? And so that's what we did. And this home, because we didn't have any shadows, we didn't have to have Box Brownie take out the shadows. Notice they also changed out the grass. They didn't get rid of the snow underneath that one bush on the left, but overall it looks pretty good. So that is one of the things that Box Brownie can also do very affordably and very quickly. So virtual twilights are a good option if you don't have, and you and your agent don't have time to get on your photographer's schedule to do an actual twilight. It can also be a good interim step to do a virtual twilight, and then when the actual twilight is done, swap that out. It's that affordable. I think Box Brownie, even including removing the shadows, is like $12 per image. It's $4 if it's a cloudy day and they don't have to remove the shadows. So it's a great option for you to use as either an actual twilight, quote unquote, or as an interim twilight. So as you can see, there's a lot that goes into photography today on the real estate side. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about is if you look at the picture behind me on the screen, what you'll notice is the walls are square. You can almost tell if you're looking at your prospective agents' photos, if the walls are not square, they're not dealing with a real estate photography company. There might be a great wedding photography or portrait photographer, but they're not real estate photographers. It's its own category. People say, can you do my headshot? And I say, I can do it, but go to somebody who specializes in that, because if they do it all day long, they'll know how to get the lighting just right on your face. They'll know how to make it look awesome. And the same thing is true with real estate photography. There are real estate photography companies out there, and that's all we do all day long is take real estate photos. We also do a bunch of other media like videos or 3D tours, and maybe we'll talk about those on a future episode. But if you're interested in more information about real estate and what's going on in the real estate world, I encourage you to go to theproshow.com and check that out. We've got almost 30 episodes now, and it's a great way for you to find out what's going on in the real estate world, find out more tips and tricks, and it's all about giving you information. It's not about gloom and doom like we see on a lot of real estate programs today. So check that out at theproshow.com, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.